We are recording now, and before I do the intro, tell me how you say your last name, please.
Lamothe.
Lamothe. Okay, that's what I thought I had it. Good. Okay. All right, we've got a special episode with Dan Lamothe. Did I say it right? Lamothe. There we
Lamothe,
go.
like the bug.
Lamothe, like the bug. There we go. Okay, right. In three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. You know that this show keeps a focus on national security, military affairs, veterans issues, global security, a lot of the stuff that most news shows gloss over and don't keep a focus on. We are always going to keep that focus. It remains, in my view, the most important issues that we need to focus on. And joining us today to break down Afghanistan, press access, and everything else that's happening is a returning champion, a friend of the show, the great and powerful Dan Lamothe is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, Dan. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great having you back. You got a suit on now, and your profile continues to rise. For folks that are watching, I got to start by asking you over your left shoulder. We have this posted on video as well. You got a lot. You're killing me here. You got a lot of Red Sox shit over your left shoulder. Is that Big Poppy over waving after winning the World Series, or what do you got over there behind you?
That is David Ortiz on kind of his send-off. And then, yes, that is a baseball from the 2004 World Series. And then, yeah, a couple photos of family.
Love it, love it. I wore my Amherst Mammoth T-shirt in honor of you, okay? Because you went to UMass, I went to Amherst. Since last we spoke, you also generously visited my seminar, my poli-sci seminar at Amherst on understanding 9/11, and talked about your story, which was awesome. So I want to thank you for that. But as I told my students, I think you're one of the most important reporters in America, and now as these conflicts, go global, maybe globally, you've been continuing to break stories. When we had you on a little over a year ago, we were talking about National Guard deployments pre-inauguration, right? So that was a really dicey time in military affairs. Fast forward, we've had an insurrection, we've had the Afghanistan implosion, we've now got Ukraine. I want to start with your most recent reporting, because you continue to break stories, and also, a hat tip to Alex Horton, who is working with you on this and is also a veteran himself, a guy that's been doing great reporting. But the headline here on Afghanistan, what I've been saying is the truth will continue to come out. And it feels like the White House has their version of the truth, and there is another version of the truth that continues to pour out in reporting, and now in your most recent reporting. So can you give us, the headlines and what you think is most important about your latest reporting on Afghanistan?
Yeah, sure. So the headline is basically that the senior U.S. military commanders who were in charge of the evacuation on the ground, two-star admiral, two-star general, one-star general, all were pretty deeply frustrated with what they were getting from Washington. Not only during the evacuation, but prior to the evacuation, there was this belief in the military that more needed to be done to prepare for the evacuation, that it could come fast, and that they needed to stage people, stage food, stage water, and really be ready for what could be a pretty big thing. They did assume, in part, that they would have some cooperation from Afghan forces in the event of an evacuation. That didn't happen, obviously. There were virtually no Afghan forces involved. You had a couple exceptions, but basically you were on your own and relying on the Taliban, at the edge of the airport. But very specifically, you've got a one-star Marine General, Sullivan, saying that he didn't think the NSC, the National Security Council, was acting with any kind of urgency. You've got the two-star admiral in charge of the whole thing, Admiral Vasely, saying that he was frustrated and felt like if they had paid more attention to the indicators in the weeks and months leading up to August, that they could have done more and been more effective. And then you've got General Donahue, the two-star from 82nd Airborne Division, who arrives a bit later. He's one who did a lot of interface with the Taliban, and pretty blunt comments about when he first got there, the tensions were still high with the Taliban. They didn't really know what they would get from the Taliban. And him saying more or less, like, you're going to have to cooperate, and if you don't, we'll be able to kill more of you than you can of us. That's not exactly like a neat and pretty picture.
So on the other side of this, and in my experience, right, what we heard from the military leaders, and your reporting has exposed, sounded like what veterans were saying, what folks like Matt Zeller were saying. This is going south. It's going south fast. You're sprinkling sunshine here and telling the American people something different. But you also exposed really what seems like a pissing match between the military leadership and the State Department. Can you talk about who was on the other side of that equation, opposite the generals, and where that friction was?
Yeah, I think you've got a couple competing things here. And I tried my hardest to get some more State Department perspective in the story. And, there was nobody on the record in the first version of the story that went up on the record. They addressed it at a briefing later in the afternoon, once the story had already been up a while, and took exception to some of the comments in there and sort of seemed to imply I was cherry picking. The reality is the whole report was filled with things along these lines. In terms of the dynamics and the friction between them, you have the military who's trying to prepare for this, have been planning for months, did have an option to potentially include Bagram in there. That was at least in the discussion. Not necessarily a best option, but like at least a part of the discussion was to use both airfields. On the flip side, you've got the ambassador, and in the eyes of the military, he didn't want to move forward with the evacuation. He saw it as important to keep the embassy. He thought without the embassy, we wouldn't be able to influence the country later. And sort of that dynamic of when do you sequence certain things, and the ambassador being concerned, and I think there's a fair point here as well. The more you do that makes it overtly obvious that you're going to evacuate, the more you may knock over some of those dominoes too. So how much can you do before you kind of set the cart in motion one way or the other?
So the issue I want to get at, and you always get at, is what's the truth, right? Like what's the core here? And can you talk about the report? You mentioned the report. What is the report? How did you get it? And why is this information only coming out now?
Sure. So this report, one, includes about 2,000 pages worth of documents. It was released to the Washington Post, and I believe probably other media outlets late Friday, as the Pentagon rolled out their top-line findings of this big investigation into that awful bombing we had, where you had 13 Americans killed and 170 Afghans, give or take. The briefing focused heavily on the bombing itself. The fact that it really was only one explosion, their belief that there wasn't anyone killed by gunfire. A lot of that was confusing in August. The story shifted over time as more information came in. This was basically their postscript on that. But then we get the report, and anytime a big report's released, I'm always looking at, okay, what's your summary say? And then what's your witness statement say? And sometimes you have to fight through FOIA in subsequent fights to get the witness statements, because there's often things in there that are not in the summary. In this case, I started looking at it Friday night. This was my Friday night, exciting guy, going through documents. And my jaw dropped repeatedly, and I ended up working until after midnight on it. And there was so much reading, and you couldn't make sense of it. Nothing was labeled where it was easy to find what was what. So you kind of had to go through it all. So picked it back up Saturday, same thing, going through it all, and I'm kind of, pulling out nuggets, putting them into buckets and categories so I can make sense of it later. I found the statements of the senior officers, found a lot of other interesting commentary from rank and file who also were there that largely have a very similar view of it all. And then, it became a scramble to get this story out as quickly as possible while being fair to those involved. While at the same time being terrified that I was not the only news media outlet with these documents. Really, right up until Jump Street, when he actually published basically at dawn on Monday, I assumed it was possible that other people were looking at the same thing. You had to go looking, you had to go read the documents, and I think that's probably why, we were able to get it out first. Is it took a whole lot of work through the weekend.
It's a testament to your work ethic, your professionalism. It's what you do, man. Like, you're the guy who reads into the 2,000-page document, looks at the witness statements, and looks for the pieces that other folks don't know to look for. But I want to push. You're one of the best reporters in the country right now. The State Department would not give you a statement. right? And they know you're running a story. This seems like their new strategy. They're stonewalling. Like, I don't know how many people at the State Department you asked, but in the initial version, I didn't see a statement from the ambassador or from National Security Advisor Sullivan or anybody. So can you break that down here? What's the State Department doing right now with regard to the press and to you?
I mean, I need to be fair about what I don't know. I primarily cover the Pentagon, so I am walking in as a bit more of a stranger on that side. I did reach out Saturday, especially Sunday, and right on through Monday night. I guess the story published Tuesday morning. And there was no on the record comment to be had. Certainly I'm having conversations on background with various people in the administration. Sometimes you'll get the administration writ large to engage on an anonymous level. And I'm trying to be fair. I will include some of those anonymous comments in the absence of something better. But it's not for a lack of effort that I'm trying to get that on the record commentary. I did get some on the record commentary from the Pentagon.
So can I ask, I always want to talk about what else and what's next. I have been one of many critics who have said no one has been held accountable for the failures in Afghanistan. No one has been held accountable for now what is clearly competing stories, right? We've got the military on one side, you got the State Department on the other side. There were clashes, it's documented. Now they can try to spin it and say you're cherry picking. They did the same thing with veterans who were saying, things are bad in Afghanistan. They want to focus on the number of people that they've gotten out of Afghanistan and not the people that were left behind. But there is a spin going on here in my view. These are my words. Blinken, Sullivan, a lot of people that I think were in key leadership positions were never held accountable. And now not only are they not accountable, they're kind of spinning it as a good news story, saying, and you see this from Kirby and others, Admiral Kirby, who used to be on CNN, now he's at the Pentagon as a spokesperson. They're trying to spin it. They're trying to say, hey, a lot of good things happened. We got a lot done. Nothing to see here as these stories continue to come out. So can you talk about the leadership specifically? And I'm talking about Blinken and Sullivan. Are there any conversations happening internally about firing them or about them resigning? Did that ever come up?
I'm aware of no conversations within the administration that would usher anybody out the door. Certainly, you've had some lawmakers who have called for it, and largely that breaks down along partisan lines. So I think it's to a degree easy for the administration to dismiss that. When it comes to what's next, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot in that report. It seemed to have caught lawmakers off guard. You had a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing the same morning my story was published. And the lawmakers were raising it as, how come we didn't know anything about this report? I don't know. Were they briefed on the report in full? Were they only briefed on the top line findings of what the Pentagon rolled out on Friday? I think all that's sort of still to be sorted out. One point I wanted to make, both give a shout out to some colleagues who also did some hard work on this. Alex Horton was the other name on this byline. Yep. When we got into August, we put in a whole lot of FOIA requests for various things. You never really know what's going to come back, and we basically split the list, try to make sense of like, okay, what are we forgetting? What do we need to get at? You never really know what you're going to find out and why, and when it's going to come back. In this case, Alex, who is currently in Ukraine, reporting from Ukraine, got the email that this FOIA request was ready. He was able to help to some degree, but we wouldn't have had this story if he didn't, with quick thinking, also, flag this for the rest of us, and we started going through it over the weekend. This story doesn't happen without him really being Johnny on the spot with that. Yeah,
I think, there's this new wave of folks, that are kind of rising. And, you've got, you've had folks like C.J. Chivers and others out there for a while who've served in the military, been close to the military, and then become reporters. But we've had James Laporta on the show. You mentioned Alex Horton. You've been very close to the military. You all know what to look for. There's a higher level of professionalism and I think experience and cultural competency that is changing the dynamic in the press corps now. It's not just folks that frankly sat at the Pentagon. It's folks that have been deployed. But it's also colliding with what seems like the Biden administration is digging in stonewalling. Like they I want to talk about Ukraine and how they're not allowing for embeds. But do you feel like the Biden administration and Psaki and the State Department specifically are just going to keep this up? They're not going to respond. They're going to say this is our version of the story. This is our story, and we're sticking to it. Is that what seems to be the strategy right now?
I mean, I think it's sort of a two things can be true kind of idea for me. One, it was a historic achievement to get that many people out. I would not dispute that point. I have had that point, written more or less verbatim in the stories I've written. That is true. And I think, to some degree, that should be seen as an achievement. It should be celebrated. There were a whole lot of people that were working virtually 24 hours a day for weeks on that. That does not preclude the discussion of all of the ugliness that also happened here and how we got there. I think we can do those stories about all of the quick thinking and the ingenuity and the hard work. We have done those stories. We'll continue to do those stories, but we have to do the accountability piece of this too. And clearly from these documents, which included, officers who had not been on the record anywhere in any serious way, going back to August. They did not see it the same way that other people in the administration do.
I mean, yeah, this is like White House Playbook 101. Okay, you say, all right, you're not telling enough of the good news stories. You're cherry picking. You're not looking at the full picture. Those are all, basic plays, right? It's throwing a fastball. Like it's a really basic political strategy. But it also is happening at a time, to your point about accountability, where there's been no accountability for failure at all. I couldn't find a single person post-Afghanistan implosion that has resigned or been fired as a result, not one in the civilian government or the military, right? And it seems like a lot of decision making came down to the president himself, and he can't fire himself. He's got Jake Sullivan, who's his national security advisor, who, in my view, either had a responsibility to either predict that this was coming or deal with it as it unfolded. And it seems like he failed in that regard. Then you've got spokespeople and others. But here's the new piece: the same exact people are in charge. And now we're on the verge of an invasion in Russia, and they're saying they won't allow embedded reporters. So I want to talk about those two pieces, but really specifically now, before we recorded, I saw the White House press corps is now backing the coalition of military journalists that is growing in power. I don't know if you're a part of that or not, but they're calling for embeds, and the White House is saying no. They're saying we won't allow embeds. So can you talk about that? And if there's, what is their latest stance on this? And is there precedent for this?
When it comes to covering a potential war in Ukraine, you're going to have several things going on. You're going to have reporters in Ukraine itself who are either embedded with the Ukrainian troops or simply just man out on the street. And depending on what this invasion looks, the war could be all around you feasibly. So it wouldn't be hard to report on that in that sense. The second piece of this is especially from the American point of view, what are the American officials doing? What is the American military doing? Where are we putting forces in our name? So yes, there have been discussions of where can you put American journalists with American troops to tell that story. That could be Poland. That could feasibly be in the Baltics if we end up there as well. That could be Germany, where they've got a couple of the headquarters that are relevant. What can you do to help us get this story out and get this story right? To date, and we now have troops in Poland and more in Germany, and they have shifted some to Romania. We have no American journalists embedded with any of those units. It's not for a lack of asking. You've seen formal organizations now lobbying to have that kind of access. The discussion at this point largely seems to hinge on what do they need to do to tell the story, and all of the sensitivities that go with covering a war. And I think in particular with Vladimir Putin involved, they're trying to massage the messaging in a way that doesn't topple the apple cart any farther.
I mean, the expectation, it seems, Dan, after the Iraq invasion, right? Which was the last time we had such a and throughout really the last 20 years has been that the White House and the administration would allow journalists to basically get up with the 82nd Airborne, fly with them on the plane, go over there and give a perspective that I want to focus on specifically to tell the American people what our sons and daughters are experiencing, but also to tell military families what our sons and daughters are experiencing, right? Like that could be someone's son or daughter, and to hear that they won't let Dan Lamothe or Alex Horton or someone else to embed at all, it seems like something that's not American to me. Has there been a time recently where the White House on either Trump or Biden or even Obama said flat out, no, we're going to do a major military exercise, of course taking into account sensitivity, operational security, we know that. But has there been a time in the last 20 years since the invasion when they said no completely?
I would take it back even farther than that. There's been an ebb and flow here. If you go back to the Gulf War, you did have a lot of frustration about a lot of media access and a lot of people asking why, the reporters were sequestered as far as they were. The idea was at the outset of, especially Iraq, because there was frustration early in Afghanistan as well. You had journalists there largely on their own. A lot of stories of them kind of sticking together in the field to tell the story, but being, a step or two removed. That changed with Iraq for the most part. That's when you started seeing, no kidding, going over, the line of departure, that kind of stuff. And then for years and years, as doors were kicked in, journalists often being in the stack even. I picked it up around 2010. That's when I started embedding. And yeah, 4 or 5 hour foot patrols in the heat with body armor was not atypical. We have done those stories. I would argue they largely have been effective in helping the American public understand what you're asking of your military. Mm-hmm. As the politics of the nation has changed, and as these operations have continued, we have seen a degradation of media access with the military that goes back, way prior to Biden, through Trump, back to Obama. Really, you had a lot of journalists in that early time frame, that surge era. That when I started embedding with the troops. By the latter half of the Obama era, it was a lot harder to get in there. And then once you get through Trump, it was very hard to get in there. There are exceptions. I spent some time down on the border, for instance. I did a trip to Afghanistan in the latter era, spent some time with General Miller and his staff shortly before that deal with the Taliban was signed. So there are a handful of exceptions. We're kind of in that same era still, I think. And I think even as the administrations have changed, there's a whole lot of reasons you could feasibly say no, that all sound realistic and sound, but it doesn't change the basic trend line that we're seeing less and less access. Yep. It doesn't change the problem of the military being removed from the American public in a lot of ways, except from what you hear from a podium.
And I want to get, the organization is called the Military Reporters and Editors Association. I think, is it Jeff Schogel who's, chairing it, or one of the leaders there now, who's another guy who's been amazing. And now I saw Steve Portnoy, from the White House Correspondents Association has echoed that call. So now you've got, the Barbara Stars of the world, and I'm sure the Martha Raditzes and others who will ask for this. And, I had an embedded unit with me in Iraq. I had a 60 Minutes crew go out on patrol with me in Baghdad multiple times in the heat with a camera and the whole deal. And I think that it was important in telling our story. I think that's where the Biden administration is missing this year. It actually does them a service in more ways than they probably recognize. But it also does compromise some of the journalistic integrity, in my view. I've always felt embeds are kind of a double-edged sword because, it's hard to objectively cover someone who's keeping you alive, right? We know that. So how do you think this will unfold? You talked about Alex and others. We've got citizen journalists on the ground. If the White House decides to totally block every piece of access, how will reporters like you and Alex cover this in real time if Russia invades Ukraine?
I think there's a couple pieces here that are important. One is going to be, what does this look like for coverage prior to an invasion, which is, I think, where we are now, where everybody's trying to be very careful. That nobody wants to kind of make any moves that might make anybody do anything too rash. I can at least understand that line of thinking. I think once you have an invasion, if you have an invasion, a lot of the arguments that you might use now go out the window. And at that point, what the American troops are doing in a place like Poland is important, not only from the perspective of letting America know what its own troops are doing, but also in what's probably going to be a pretty ugly disinformation campaign. And the best way to get around that would be to have an independent, credible voices that can say, no, this is actually what they're doing in Poland, not what you're hearing from the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm. Dan, can you look ahead? What are the questions now that you are asking? Without obviously, I know you're going to probably drop a new story every 48 hours. I hope for the next couple of days and weeks. But what do you think are the biggest unanswered questions? That is particularly at the White House. What are they refusing to answer, whether it's about Afghanistan or Ukraine, that you think are most important? That maybe they continue to just kick you guys on, like, and stiff arm you and say, we're not going to answer this. There are a couple things that you think are important that might be next?
I mean, on Afghanistan, I think it's important to keep having those conversations about what happened. I think it's important to have conversations about what else might be done, even though options are a lot more limited than they used to be, particularly when we do have people still there and we do have interpreters and cultural advisors and whoever else that assisted us that are still relying on us in theory. I'm still getting emails every day, and I'm sure you probably are too. On Ukraine, I feel like so far, at least, there's this effort to do everything they can, but there's a couple hard lines that you just can't get around. If for whatever, and I think this is like an extreme, like 5 layers of aggression that I don't know that we're ever going to see. If this were to spill into a NATO ally, the obligation would be there. And the president has already said that we would, meet our treaty obligations, and that we would end up in some way trying to push back on that. If this stays in Ukraine, and even if this gets extremely ugly and extremely bloody, and the estimates are horrific, tens of thousands of civilians potentially killed, 5 million refugees potentially, like very serious thing, but it stays contained. I think we're going to look for ways to help on the margins. We're probably going to have to deal with the flow of migrants out of the country. And then there will be all the discussions of sanctions and what do you do to marginalize this kind of behavior. But I don't know that there's any appetite for this to become our war.
I wanted to ask you. I want to ask you one more thing about this journalistic landscape we're in right now, because obviously the White House is clamping down on access. In my view, they're spinning on Afghanistan and other places. But a couple years ago, we had outpourings of whistleblowers. And it seems like we're in this lull period, and maybe it's an eye of the storm, where there don't seem to be a lot of whistleblowers. And there are a lot of people who know what happened in Afghanistan for real. There are a lot of people who know what's happening now around Ukraine. And I don't know if the reaction to Chelsea Manning and to Snowden and others have chilled whistleblowers, but you've also got Vindman now, who's out in the media sphere commenting on all things. So can you frame that up? I mean, are there less whistleblowers than there used to be because of all of these chilling policy moves that have happened over the last couple of years?
I think it's probably partly a function of timing, and partly a function of what we saw over the last few years. The Trump administration was chaotic. It had all kinds of problems to cover, and it was also extremely leaky. They loved to talk about things journalists were doing that they shouldn't have been, but the reality is there were a whole lot of Trump administration officials who regularly were spilling backroom conversations. That's not typical, not on that level. Maybe you'd see it in a Bob Woodward book or something on occasion, but you wouldn't see it basically every day. I do think you're seeing some message discipline out of the Biden administration that didn't exist for the last few years. So that's one reason it's a little more quiet. The second piece is we're still relatively early in this administration. People tend to talk once they leave government. You're not, we're not far enough along where you're seeing a lot of people moving on with their life, resigning, shifting to things where they, might be more comfortable talking about what they saw, what they did, that kind of thing.
I think that's really one of the areas to watch over the next couple of months, especially. And who knows how that dynamic will change if there's a new Congress in the fall and once the election campaign starts to ratchet up. But I continue to be surprised that right now, maybe it's an evolution, but the FOIA requests are happening. And that's like this phase. I feel like the next phase is a general or two who you got in that testimony come out and say, let me tell you the real story. And that's the exclusive on 60 Minutes and the book and all of that. Maybe that's the next phase to come. And if it does, I know you'll be on top of it. I have one really hard question for you before we leave. You're a big sports fan. Super Bowl is this weekend. It's a great clash with the Bengals and the Rams. Who are you picking?
Ooh, I'm picking the Rams. I kind of hope the Bengals win.
Excellent. Can you? You're not a predicting guy, but in sports maybe you are. You got a score prediction here.
That's out of my lane. I can. My analysis would be that the Rams would likely win. How about that? But I just think the Bengals are a really cool story, and I think that would be fun for America.
Absolutely. I think it would be fun for America if you got to do investigative journalism around sports for a couple weeks. Until then, I mean, your reporting has been heroic and historic and really important. And I'm glad to see you're on TV more often. Folks are asking you to break stuff down, and we need your voice now more than ever. So thank you for your incredible work. Thanks to Alex Horton and the entire team over there that's telling us what we need to know. And I hope you'll come back and visit us again. And until then, stay vigilant, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
And go Yanks.
Nah.